Hello, greetings, and welcome to the Enabling Policy Environment for Effective Disaster Management, including for COVID-19 response. I'm Joe Burton. I'm the co-rapporteur of question 5.2 in the ITUD study groups. Today, our webinar is comprised of two panels. A first panel on the overall enabling policy environment for effective disaster management, with a second a second session on a focus on policies that enable communications during COVID. We're pleased that you could join us. We are also pleased to have, well, actually, could we please have someone from the ITU read the guidelines for remote participation?
Yes, sure, I can do it now. Just a sec. One sec. Right, yeah, here. And do you want me to show this, or I'm just reading? That webinar guidelines. All participants and moderators in this meeting are remote. When taking the floor, please use a headset to minimize background noise and improve the quality of the sound. Please check that your microphone and camera are muted once the meeting starts. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand through the Zoom application or write a message on the chat. The moderators will give you the floor when it is your turn. For those unfamiliar with the Zoom platform, the raise hand function is located at the bottom of the participant window. To access the participant window, click the participant button in the bottom bar of the Zoom interface. Participants will be able to unmute themselves when the moderator recognizes them. Other than that, kindly make sure your microphone is muted. Please use the chat only for raising questions or making comments related to the topic or asking for the floor. This will help us to moderate this meeting. It is advisable to turn the video off and only have it when speaking. In case of low quality, the moderator may turn off all remaining cameras. The meeting will be recorded for report writing purposes, and the recording will be posted on the webinar event webpage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If we could, if Dr. Ahmad Reza Sharafat is available, we would greatly, we would be honored for some welcoming remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Joe. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you around the globe. My name is Ahmad Sharafat. I am the chair of ITUD Study Group 2 and professor of ECE at TMU. Considering the urgent need to utilize all resources available to the world community in combating the COVID-19 pandemic, in the development sector in ITU, we have planned for a series of public webinars on the vital role of ICTs in mitigating the impact of COVID-19. As part of our work in ITUD Study Group 2, in addition to our webinar today, one more webinar is planned for tomorrow, July 15, from 14 hours to 15:40 Central European Time. I would like to begin our webinar today by welcoming the panelists and the participants to this webinar with two sessions. As Mr. Burton already said, session 1 is on the enabling policy environment for effective disaster management, and session 2 is focusing on policies that enable communications during COVID-19. This webinar is part of our work and studies on question 5.2 in ITUD Study Group 2. Today we have two very able moderators, Mr. Joseph Burton, who is the co-rapporteur for question 5.2 from the International Communications and Information Policy in the US, and Mr. Abdul Karim Oloide, who is the vice rapporteur for question 5.2 from the Federal Ministry of Communication and Digital Economy in Nigeria. We also have 8 very distinguished expert panelists, and they are Mr. Juan Roldan, Mr. Chris Anderson, Mr. Paul Margay, Ms. Maritza Delgado, Ms. Catherine O'Brien, Professor Yosuke Shibasaki, Ms. Funke Upek, and Mr. Raul Watts. Before ending my opening remarks, I would like to use this opportunity to invite you all to participate in our work and in our studies in ITUD Study Group 2. Ladies and gentlemen, without further delay, I invite Mr. Joseph Burton to begin moderating the first session. The floor is yours. Joe, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sharafat. I understand that it's a tradition before a workshop starts to do a group photo. So if I could encourage colleagues who are able to turn their cameras on, please do. We'd love to see you for a group photo. And then please feel free to turn them off as you're not speaking. But and ITU colleagues, please let us know when we have a quorum of colleagues.
Okay, ready?
Best smile, everyone.
And one more time, we have more on the other side. Just one more sec. Ready, everybody?
Yeah, this is your opportunity to be a star.
Yeah, it seems it's good. Great,
Oh,
done.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Great,
much.
thank you. All right, so let's launch into panel 1, which has to do with overall enabling policies, because that is the focus of the year 2020 for study question 5.2. And so on our panel, the enabling policy environment for effective disaster management, we're very fortunate to have 3 colleagues with us who understand the importance of enabling policies and have worked on them from 3 different perspectives. Mr. Juan Roldan of Luxon Consulting has helped countries draft their national emergency telecommunications plans, their NETPs, a major enabling policy. Mr. Chris Anderson of CenturyLink has looked at emergency preparedness and telecommunications response as a telecom carrier and as part of a regulator's public safety group. Paul Margay is with Telecom Sans Frontières. He has experienced this as an ICT responder. So what we'd like to do is start panel 1 with each of our panelists making a short presentation on enabling policies, starting with Mr. Juan Roldan. You have the floor, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot, Joe, and good morning to everybody for me, or good afternoon for some of you, and maybe good evening to others. I'm very happy to be here. First of all, let me thank the ITU for organizing this event and inviting me to this panel. I'm more than happy to share some thoughts on this topic with this distinguished group of panelists and this excellent audience. As Joe mentioned, I've been working with several countries around the world recently on the development of national emergency telecommunication plans. And I'm gonna highlight throughout my short presentation of maybe 4 minutes or so, 2 slides. One of those will be presenting the challenges that are faced on the development of these plans, and also very related to the topic of our panel, enabling policies for emergency telecommunications. And second, I will go through some policies that I believe are critical for effective disaster management and the development of these national emergency telecommunication plans, as well as enabling policies for disaster relief and so on. So if you allow me, can you go to slide number 2 and present slide number 2? I'm only looking at the first slide of my presentation. So I'm not able to go through the slides. So whoever has the slides, could you please show slide number 2?
Let me know, because I'm changing the slides. Now it's the second one that you don't see.
No, I'm only looking at the one at the first slide.
Wait.
I don't know if the other people are looking to the second slide, but I'm looking.
I will share one more time.
Yeah, thank you.
Because yeah, because I was about to change. Actually, I can see. This is not right one. Okay, now.
I don't know if all the participants are looking to the second slide. I'm still looking to the first one. But
Only
if
the
the other
first one
people
for me
are
as
looking
well.
to the second one.
Okay. Okay, just a sec.
Oh,
so
okay.
we go again here. We'll share. And
now there we go.
okay.
So I will start with one of the main challenges to develop the national or implement the national emergency telecommunication plans as well is the lack of sometimes political support from the high levels in the government. I think that governments should allocate enough resources to develop these plans. That means capital resources, human resources to this endeavor. There needs to be an administrative structure in place. You need to have telecom ICT equipment also in place or acquire those from the government and also from the private sector. You need to do technical studies regarding these topics, and you need to go through training and drills to be able to respond to disasters. So political support is kind of the first one that I want to highlight, and one of the most important ones is that it's needed. It's not only verbally saying so or expressing so, it's that you need to have the resources for the development of the plan and for enabling policies and make them work for disaster management. Let's remember that priorities on the governments are where the resources are located. So governments need to have that in mind and allocate the necessary resources for these plans to develop and for having enabling policies for disaster relief. Second one that I want to highlight is who is responsible for the development, implementation, and update of the National Emergency Telecommunication Plan, and also for putting in those policies into work. This is not always clear. The experience I've had in different places that we have been developing these plans and working with the government is that most of the time there's not a clear entity or agency from the government which is responsible for emergency telecommunications and for developing the policies and laws and regulations and all that needs to be done. Or at least it's not clear who should be responsible, who is accountable. So one of the second challenges I see here is that governments need to structure how is the governance of the emergency telecommunication plan and the response to disasters using telecommunications and ICTs. There are also challenges in the development of national emergency telecommunication plans and the developing of these policies when you don't have a multi-stakeholder approach. Multi-stakeholder approach is critical. You need to have the government agencies involved, not only the telecom ICT agencies of the government, but also customs, also finance, also the national management offices for disaster relief as well. There are other agencies from the government that need to be involved. You need to have also the private sector with internet service providers, with mobile providers, telecom ICT network and service providers as well, civil society and international organizations, the NGOs and so on. All of this need to participate and contribute to the final agreement and commitment for the emergency telecommunication plan, and also for enabling policies and coordination among all of them. Coordination and communication is critical as well among all of those. And you need to have a multi-stakeholder approach, commitment from all of them to be able to coordinate and communicate in disaster relief. And finally, one of the critical challenges that I want to highlight here is the lack or poorly existence of early warning systems. I highlight this one among many other that also are important within the National Emergency Telecommunication Plan, because I do think that these are critical. I mean, early emergency management systems or early warning systems saves lives. These systems are critical to allow communities to make quick decisions to avoid hazards in a timely way. So telecom ICT tools are critical not only to warn these communities, but also to detect the hazards and track them. So those are the four, I would say, first challenges that I want to highlight in this discussion in this panel. And would like also in my next slide and final slide to, can we go to the next slide, please? To highlight some policies that are also needed to implement these national emergency telecommunication plans and to have an environment that it's enabling for disaster relief and disaster response as well. So we should go to the third slide, please.
Let me know if you can see this slide.
No, I'm looking at the second slide still.
Well, something wrong here. Just stop sharing and share the screen one more time. Go here. Now you can see, right?
Yes, perfect. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
So policies for developing national emergency telecommunication plans, we can have that there are 4 principles that are highlighted in the guidelines, in the ITU guidelines, which are having a multi-stakeholder approach, as I mentioned before, the commitment of not only the government, but all the private sector and other civil societies, NGOs involved, having a multi-hazard approach, which means you have to account all the hazards in your country that you have risks to. You have a multi-technology approach, which means that you need to have also different types of technologies involved, and as much as you can, the technologies that you need to make to face all these disasters in your country, and multi-phase approach to the all 4 phases of disaster management, which are mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. However, I'm not going to go into those. I'm going to highlight some 6 or so specific policies that I think are critical for this as well. The first one will be to enable a relevant regional international cooperation, mainly through the Tampere Convention. Not all the countries around the world are signatures or belong to the Tampere Convention. I think this is critical because this will allow you to facilitate the use of telecom ICT resources in case of a disaster. It reduces regulatory barriers. It allows quicker telecom ICT deployment infrastructures, and it gives some kind of security to the personnel that we will deploy in those infrastructure. The second one I want to highlight here, again, is coordination and communication among different stakeholders. This is key and should be clearly established in the standard operating procedures that need to be developed across and within organizations. Develop hazard maps and ICT telecom networks infrastructure maps as well, so you can be able to update those timely and make analysis of critical vulnerabilities and so of the networks that you have, and with those be able to develop contingency plans or specific plans that are needed in places where you have risks of hazards and disaster. That is critical as well. You need to have those policies in place on how to update those hazard maps and how to have ICT telecom network maps as well updated. One that it's very critical, and nowadays we have seen that that in the response to COVID-19, which is network capacity and redundancy. Basically, we are all working from our houses on quarantines, curfews, and so on. So network congestion could be critical. So somehow capacity and redundancy of the network has been critical in this pandemic that we are right now. And it is in mainly any other disaster that we could face when terrestrial networks could be shut down and so on. We need to have a second way or be clear on how to communicate with others during those circumstances as well. Flexible regulations, I think there's a panel later on this today about regulations, but just to highlight that having a regulatory framework that it's flexible in terms of allowing temporary license services or allowing temporary authorization for frequency use or allowing reporting of the networks and how are they answering to different hazards or disasters are critical as well. This could bring also the private sector, the ICT, telecom, network and service providers as well to discuss those flexible regulations and implement them in an efficient way. And finally, I want to highlight the policy that, one of the policies that I think is critical as well is practice. Practice makes the master, and implementing drills, training capacity building, etc., to better react to disasters is critical. So with that, Joe, I think I'm gonna end my presentation. I think that I have highlighted some topics that I believe are critical and are important, not saying that the other ones that you find in developing the national emergency telecommunication plans or policies are not. They are also important as well, but I want to focus on these ones that I believe are, for the moment, critical for the disaster relief activities and so on. So thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Juan. Okay, so we're going to have two more very brief presentations, and then open it up for question and answer as time allows. As you have a question, you are encouraged to either put it in chat or raise your hand. But please, our next speaker, Mr. Chris Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. As my slides load up, I'll just very briefly talk about the perspective I'll be bringing to the table. And if you can just start right with slide 2, CenturyLink, the company I'm representing, is a global backbone provider, presence across the globe, and really running the gamut between business lines as a core backbone provider, provider to large enterprises, and then all the way down to individual consumer level access. So a pretty broad perspective of potential problems in disaster response. Personally, I've been with CenturyLink for about a year now, but my background includes a fair amount of time approaching this problem from a regulatory perspective, working emergency management at the Federal Communications Commission, and then additionally some time focused on these kinds of problems within government, but in a non-regulatory. It's part of the voluntary partnership that the US operates through our Department of Homeland Security with critical infrastructure owner and operators. Next slide, please. I'm going to cover 5 main policy areas today that I think are important to highlight. I think the foundational one is the public-private partnership that is necessary for effective disaster management, partnering the government and its equities along with the commercial space. So in this public-private partnership, it's really important to work to balance the commercial, regulatory, public safety, and national security equities. So those are often aligned, but not always. Fundamental to the public-private partnership are to establish the policies, laws, if necessary, to govern how information sharing will work. This is particularly important when you have commercial entities who may have restrictions sharing information with each other through antitrust laws. They may be reluctant to share information with the government if they believe they might be opening themselves up to regulatory action. So really figuring out how you can enable that sharing environment is critical. And for each country, that's going to have a different set of problems, but really clearly identifying the barriers to information sharing up front is really important. probably even more important than that is to ensure that you're establishing this partnership in what I like to call the blue sky scenarios. This is not something you can put together during a crisis and have it work. You need to be bringing together the right people, talking regularly. In the US, we actually do a weekly call that includes all of the main carriers, many of the mid-sized carriers, the regulator, the Department of Homeland Security, our Federal Emergency Management Agency, state and local representatives, and every week we all get on and we talk together about the resiliency issues of the day. And that becomes the core group of people who knows each other, who has each other's contact information, and that sort of coalesces into the crisis action group when disaster strikes. The next critical policy, I think, is to really establish and think through upfront how the regulator can execute flexibility and adaptation during disaster. So in the US, one of the ways that we do this is through the Federal Communications Commission. Every time there's a major disaster, the commission really focuses on speed is of the essence. They need to take requests for special temporary authority for new spectrum, experimental licenses, and turn those around as quickly as possible to the point where they actually have a full-time 24/7 operation center that has the ability to on the spot issue special temporary authorities to operate that will be valid until the end of the next business day. So the regulator is almost never a roadblock to putting good solutions in place. The third thing that I think is important to stress is the integration of communications into the entire preparedness, into response preparedness and execution. So in the US, one of the key ways that we do this is at the national level, and many states sort of run a very similar structure. We have a number of task-based organizations that coordinate incident response. And in the US, we have our emergency support function. It's support function number 2. I don't know why. Transportation is 1, and comms is 2, and energy is 12. But it brings together all of the people who are focused on this as a problem, whether it's first responders really looking tactically at how communications are being used in a disaster, or more on the consumer side, what are the private sector roadblocks to allowing the sort of general population to communicate with each other, for political leaders to push out emergency information, et cetera. Some of the ways that that can be better executed is thinking through even things as tactical as, are people invited into emergency operations centers? Where do people sit and how do they communicate? Do you have a room at the state level emergency operations center where the power people can talk readily to the communications people, and so forth? One of the issues that always seems to come up during these kinds of disasters are the things that are in some cases literal roadblocks for carriers. Number one, being able to get access into the disaster areas to be able to repair and restore sites. Access both to get, to procure fuel, but also to be able to deliver it. Very often with most disasters, electricity becomes an issue, which means communications will be operating on generators, which means fuel and the security of those generators and fuel becomes really, really important. One of the strange little issues that often comes up are protecting wireline assets as debris removal and as cleanup begins to happen from a disaster. Very often those fibers may even be on the ground or just underground, but they're still lit and they're delivering data and comms, but they can be severed by well-meaning debris removal personnel. The next area that I think is really important to think through is communications priority. And this is actually two sides of a coin. On the front side, it's identifying as much in advance as possible what are the critical things we need to be able to do, what are the communication paths that those activities rely upon, and then focus on the resilience and the hardening of those paths. So that becomes a sort of a partnership with the carriers or the government entities who are building those paths, because you have to build that resiliency in from the ground up, and that's going to take time and that's going to take resources. So if you want a 5 nines 99.999 reliable circuit, you need to pay for that up front. The second piece is understanding that nothing survives certain disasters, is to figure out how you're going to prioritize network traffic post-disaster. So what comms are going to receive priority? Are there the technical mechanisms in place to actually execute that priority? The last piece is to talk about situational reporting, and really at a high level to be able to define up front what kinds of information you need in a disaster situation, and communicate that to the communications providers so that they can build out the technical and the operational processes to provide that information. Sorry for the rapid fire talk. There's a lot here. It's a topic I'm very passionate about, but I will leave it there for now and hand it over to my next panelist. Thank you.
Paul Margie, please.
Hello. So while my slides are loading up, I'm Paul Margie. I'm with Telecom Sans Frontières. We're an international emergency response telecom NGO. Oh, had him there for a second. And I just want to say thank you for including us in this panel. We really appreciate it. We worked with a lot of you before, both with your countries or with your organizations. Thank you to Joe also, who's been so helpful to us over the years. So we can go to the next slide, please. So just a short background on TSF for those who haven't worked with us before. We're a telecom-based NGO. We have a headquarters in France and deployment bases in Mexico and in Thailand. We started during the Balkans conflict and developed into the world's first NGO focusing on restoring international telecommunications links in emergency response. Next slide, please. We've, in the past 20 years, deployed all over the world to every major natural disaster, many conflicts, and long-term emergencies as well, especially refugee and migration crises. And what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about what we've learned in working in these different countries about the wide variety of emergency response policy frameworks that we've seen, and what the common elements of those that are successful are. And let me say, there's really no one answer to this question. There's not one system. There are incredibly different systems in different countries that work very well, from large countries to small, some that focus on one area or another, but we have seen some commonalities. Next slide, please. And what we do, we see these commonalities is we're delivering different types of services. Our number one goal is disaster response. So we've got emergency response teams around the world that work to be on the ground within 48 hours of an emergency. Once we get there, we set up an emergency telecommunications center for the disaster responders, for the UN staff, for local governments, for sister NGOs, for anyone who needs our help as another first responder. The second thing we do is humanitarian calling programs, where we have itinerant groups that will go around the city or around the country in order to provide a free 3-minute call to survivors, to refugees, whoever needs the help. And then in the past 5 or so years, we've also had itinerant Wi-Fi connectivity where we'll go and set up at a different place each day in order to provide data connectivity to populations. In between those, we do long-term emergencies in migration crises, in food crises, in medical crises. We also do training, working with local responders, NGOs, the UN as well. Next slide, please. And this is where I'll spend the rest of my time. So in doing that, we've noticed commonalities in places that work. And our goal is to get into the country as quickly as possible, to work under the framework of that country's response rather than what we think is best, and to try to help as many people as quickly as possible. And when we've done that, we've noticed 5 things that we always hope that a country will have done. So we boiled these down into our humble recommendations to policymakers to try to think, what would we want to see if we are deploying to a country where we can do the most good. And I also say this from, I was at the United Nations Foundation, I've been in the private sector, and I've been at an NGO. And as you heard in the first 2 presentations, there's a lot of commonality in the experience of these as well. So number 1, you've heard this from both of the other speakers, is training. And the training can be different from place to place. I've seen, an exceptional training in Japan, for example, which may have best in the world telecommunications training in terms of integrating their companies with their governments as well. We've seen incredible training with NGOs in places like the Philippines, where year after year we'll see efforts to link local responders with NGOs. But the key is that it's consistent, that people aren't meeting each other for the first time in an emergency, and that you don't have a kind of break glass, pull lever emergency response system, because that typically gathers dust and doesn't work when the emergency hits. This does not have to be the same training for everyone. It doesn't have to be over the top, exceptionally expensive training, but the consistency matters, and making sure that it's diverse in that you have NGO, private, government, and IGO responders. Number 2 is recognition, and this can feel a little softer for some policymakers versus others, but we found that it is correlated with countries that have success in the field, which is a formal recognition of ICTs as critical infrastructure. And this is because while the people on this Zoom understand the relationship between ICTs and all the other aspects of emergency response, if you want to have power, you need ICTs. If you want to have security, you need ICTs. If you want to have health and sanitation, you need ICTs. But you may have found, like we did, that people in other ministries or other regulators or in the security forces that are manning protective efforts, that there's not as clear an understanding of the role of ICTs in an emergency. This is sometimes generational. It's sometimes based on the type of ministry that we're dealing with. But countries that have formally recognized ICT as critical infrastructure in a way that includes not only the telecom or communications ministry and regulator, but also the emergency responders, the customs ministry, securities police, and logistics agencies, have gone through that process to make sure they educate their colleagues in these other ministries, and that they have a policy infrastructure to include ICT from the very beginning in their training and in their understanding of what their instructions are to their people in the field. Third is kind of at the opposite extreme, from very, very high level to very, very on the ground, which are points of contact. This is another thing that we see is highly correlated with success in the field. If a country has, before an emergency, publicly identified agency points of contact for ICT response, we see that as an indicator that this country is going to do better in an emergency. When an emergency hits, it is often chaos. It is very difficult to know who to work with. If you want your policies implemented correctly, people have to know who to ask questions to and who to seek permissions from. In some countries, this is part of the training so that people know where to go in an emergency. In others, you can arrive in the field and have no idea. And you'll have two similarly situated responders who are given two answers from two completely different people. The other thing is that points of contact have to be multiple. So in an emergency, often the first point of contact is unavailable for a variety of reasons. And when that happens, there has to be a secondary option here that works. The way to make points of contact work is for them to be continually providing information even outside of an emergency. So if there's a point of contact that people know, maybe not an individual, maybe a particular a particular email or a particular entity or a particular office, and it is providing information on the training that occurs, it's providing updates on what's happening, then that again doesn't get dusty and people will use that point of contact. Fourth is entry. So this is one of the ones that we see most often, is that when an emergency hits, people typically have very little time to prepare, and you need to get the people and the equipment that you need from outside of the country into it, or from one part of the country into the disaster area. More than anything else, we see this as a literal barrier, as you heard from Chris, like an actual roadblock where people are stopped from coming into the country or stopped to go to an emergency response zone. The telecommunications ministry often wants to be able to help in these situations, but if there's not a pre-positioned process for making that happen with your sister agencies, it's often very difficult to do in an emergency. And this again is linked back to number 2, to the recognition. If there's a recognition in place, you can go to your customs agents, you can go to your security people, and if it's done well, there's more of a path there. But in many countries, we lose days or even a week getting to the right place, and that has real world consequences in terms of that delay. And then the last, you've heard this from a couple people too, is something specific to the telecom ministry or regulator, which is a special temporary authority. It's called different things in different countries, but in some countries, and sometimes it's very formal, and sometimes it's informal. I tend to like the more formal ones because I know exactly what to do, but sometimes the informal ones can work. But the idea is that someone needs to have authority to be able to alter the rules for a short period of time to allow positive change that helps people in an emergency. So somebody loses half their cell towers and you want to give them permission to increase their power. You know, how does that happen? Do you have to have under your rules a 60-day waiting period because in a normal period? Well, how do you waive that 60-day waiting period? Someone needs to bring a piece of equipment into the country that you know is necessary, but typically would have to have a particular tariff on it. Well, you don't want that tariff now because you want that in there. How do you waive that? If you don't know ahead of time and there isn't a clear process, you're going to waste weeks getting through it, and weeks mean people. So we recommend that as well. So 5 hopefully clear things. I'm happy to talk about any of these in more specific context, but train beforehand, work with your colleagues to formally recognize ICTs, set up points of contact that really work and have them work. Make sure that you understand how entry works for people and equipment and make that as easy as possible, and have a special temporary authority system so that you can make changes when you need to most. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And thanks to all of our panelists. We only have a few minutes, probably just to get to 1 or maybe 2 questions. But there have been some questions about special temporary authorities, and I think panelists have addressed it in that it's not a process to waive all the rules, but it is a process that enables a decision maker to act with more speed and empowerment. If any panelists have any thoughts, any further thoughts on special temporary authorities and how they are implemented, please advise, because I think there may be a feeling that they will cause congestion and interference. And I think it's been well addressed that it's more so just to have a flexible process to speed decision making. But do any other panelists have any other thoughts on that?
I'll say real quick, and then maybe Chris, because he's actually granted STAs, I think, in the past. I think that you can cabin a special temporary authority any way you want it to be, and there's still a decision maker. So if somebody comes in and says, I want to use a new frequency band, and you are concerned that there's going to be interference, you don't have to allow it. It's not an automatic thing that it's just a free-for-all. The STAs that I've seen in countries around the world still have a government decision maker that has to say yes. On the other hand, if a licensee already has authority for a particular band and they're asking to use higher power within their band, or they're asking to use more directionalized antenna, or they are asking to use a new piece of equipment, or you might have a service specific requirement on a band and they want to be able to share it with one of their another company in order to increase service. All those things are possible. So you could have a list of available things that could be done by the STA that's approved in advance, or you could have a decision maker to make that point. But in any case, you would always have a fail-safe of somebody at the ministry or the regulator that could say, no, we don't want to give authority for a private sector actor to work in a government band, for example. And so that's still there. I have not seen the successfully granted STAs lead to interference. What I have seen is, in the absence of STAs, people just turning on radios and going because they don't know what to do, and that's what causes interference.
Paul, thank you so much. It's a really important point to end on. I know that we definitely need now to turn over to session 2. So I'd like to thank our session 1 panelists, and I'd like to give the floor to our Vice Rapporteur in question 5.2, Mr. Abdul Karim Oloyede, for session 2, a focus on policies that enable communications during COVID. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that. My name is Abdul Karim. I am one of the Vice Rapporteur for study question 5.2. And I will quickly go into the presentations today for session 2. We have 5 fantastic speakers. We have Ms. Maritza Delgado from the ITU. We have Ms. Catherine O'Brien from the Federal Communications Commission. We have Mr. Ryosuke Shibasaki from the University of Tokyo. Then we have Ms. Funke Okweke from Main One. She's the CEO of Main One in Nigeria. And we have Mr. Rahul Vats, who is the Chief Regulatory Officer for the India and South Asia Airtel Limited. So we are going to give the floor to the first speaker, who is going to be Ms. Maritza Delgado. She is the Program Officer of the Environment and Emergency Telecommunication Division within the ITU. She holds a degree in electronics engineering, and she has over 13 years experience in the field of disaster management. Maritza, you have the floor. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here with us today in this very, very important workshop. I am going to talk about the ICT and regulatory key initiatives that countries have put in place in response to COVID-19. Next slide, please. And we all know that these pandemic has become one of the biggest health crises that we have faced in recent history, not only because of the virus, but also the measures taken to mitigate the spread of the virus through isolation and social distancing, which have caused a new way of living. And this workshop is just one example of that. Unlike other disasters that we have talked before, that may cause severe devastation to telecom ICT infrastructure, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused an increase on the use of this infrastructure, especially in data traffic on both wired and wireless networks due to the higher online communications demand during the confinement. For example, as all of us working from home and having our kids as well with us taking online classes all at the same time, and also for people undertaking daily activities via the internet. This has demonstrated the essential role of having in place robust, resilient, and secure ICT infrastructure. However, this internet is not only for homes, it's also to hospitals and medical institutions that need to have access to information and resources around the world necessary to fight the virus. So what has ITU been doing since the outbreak of this pandemic? Next slide, please. We have built the Global Network Resiliency Platform, which is called REG for COVID, and it's available online. This is a place where regulators, policymakers, and other interested stakeholders can share information, view what initiatives and measures have been introduced around the world, and discuss and exchange among peers on experiences, ongoing initiatives, and innovative policy and regulatory measures designed to help ensure communities remain connected during this crisis and to prepare for the medium and long-term recovery from this pandemic. This is just one example of what we have been doing. From our side, from our division, we have developed a contingency plan for pandemics. The first speaker, Mr. Juan Roldan, he mentioned the National Emergency Telecommunication Plans. And all those plans are based on the ITU guidelines for National Emergency Telecommunication Plans that were released not too long ago. They were launched online as well. So this document provides the opportunity to have a step-by-step resources on what to do to deliver and to have the telecom ICT service delivery and business continuity in this specific context of the pandemic. And outlines a set of actions that countries could take to prepare for, anticipate, and be ready to promptly respond and ensure network continuity and service delivery for all. And we have talked about, next slide please, how important are the regulatory and regulatory frameworks and the legislation that will support these contingency plans or the use of ICTs for emergency purposes. So we have that legislation and regulation to improve this capacity for emergency response. Policy decisions, decrees, and regulations for the use of telecom ICTs for emergency response must be issued at the highest level, typically by national government, but also, and we have heard also before from other speakers, that this does not only correspond to one authority. It needs to be done through a multi-stakeholder approach, having all the entities involved in disaster management and emergencies to take place to develop these so it can benefit all. So we've seen that decrees and resolutions among other legal instruments are key to provide a good response to the use of ICTs in pandemics. We have, next slide, please. in this report, we have in the guidelines and the contingency plan, we have put together some initiatives and who will be the leading agency that will be responsible for taking the lead and continue with it. So we have the initiatives for the regulatory agencies and the ministries of ICTs. We have also some initiatives for the service providers and the operators, and also to the initiatives by content providers and online providers. So for example, very simple, and we have heard already that as well, the temporary spectrum licenses and fast expedition of permits to respond to the increase in traffic. And this, for example, corresponds to the regulatory authorities, and this will be part of the regulatory initiatives. And here I have stated just some very few examples of all the things that, the initiatives that we have received through the platform. Like, for example, increasing broadband capacity, speeds, offering additional data, like in the regulatory initiatives, providing free service to customers, etc., etc. Offering additional data, free access to online learning resources, increasing broadband speeds. So this is something that we have taken into consideration and we have incorporated in this very short contingency plan. And I just want to highlight that the speed and efficiency of a response to any emergency is proportional to the level of preparedness that we have. So let's be prepared in advance to reduce social and economic vulnerability. And with this, I end my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maritza. You said the key is for us to be prepared. Please, I want to remind our speakers that we have about 4 minutes for each of the speakers. And I will go to the next speaker now, who is going to be Ms. Catherine O'Brien, who is the Chief of Staff of the International Bureau at the U.S. Federal Communications Commission. In this capacity, she assists the Bureau Chief with the management and oversight function and provides policy support and guidance to the Bureau Chief. Prior to joining the International Bureau, Ms. O'Brien worked on wireless and cable issues at the FCC and was in private practice in Washington, D.C. She's a graduate of Smith College and the Northeastern University School of Law. Ms. O'Brien, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and good morning, I guess afternoon and evening to everybody participating today. I appreciate your interest in this, in these really important issues. I just want to start by acknowledging up front that I think we should all approach this exercise with a proper dose of humility. For most of us, this is our first time dealing with a health crisis of this magnitude, and in many ways, we're still sort of building the airplane while we're flying it. That said, I think we've all gained some useful insights over the past few months, or as our FCC chairman has called them, guiding principles, as we've approached this challenge. And so I wanted to share with you from the FCC's perspective what a few of those guiding principles are. So next slide, please. The very first principle our chairman has focused on is to set clear priorities from the very beginning. If everything is a priority in a crisis, then nothing is the top priority. And so with very limited time and capacity at the FCC, we needed to make quick assessments about what is our most important national objective that the FCC as an institution could help with, where we could make a difference. And looking at the landscape back in the early days of the spread in the United States in March, a few things became clear. First is that social distancing was going to force huge sectors of our economy and most people to go online, which of course makes internet access that much more important. And second is that social distancing was going to create massive temporary job losses and furloughs, which is going to put millions of people at risk of not being able to pay their bills, including for that internet access and for telephone service. So our chairman decided that our top priority as a communications regulator was going to be to make sure that as many people as possible have internet access, and that no American would have their internet access or voice services cut off because of the disruptions caused by the pandemic, which is related to the second principle, which is to, where possible, look to the market and to the private sector before jumping to mandates. It can be sort of more efficient and have sort of quicker results. And so what the FCC chairman did in the United States is rather than jumping to a regulatory mandate to keep consumers connected, he reached out to our industry and asked them first to step up to address this top priority. And they agreed. We developed what we call the Keep Americans Connected Pledge, which had 3 core commitments that companies made. No consumer would lose service over the next 2 months because of the disruptions caused by the pandemic. No one would be charged late fees, and companies would make Wi-Fi hotspots, would open them up to anyone who needed them. And the response was overwhelmingly positive. More than 700 broadband providers and phone providers signed the pledge. We were able to extend the initial 60-day commitment to June 30th. And so it was an extraordinary success. However, of course, no company in any sector really can afford to provide service without being paid for forever. And so we've transitioned out of the initial pledge and are working on more long-term and sustainable solutions. In this next period, the chairman has asked companies to please do what they can to keep consumers connected, work with consumers on payment plans for outstanding bills and things like that. But we also recognize that more is needed. And so just recently, in the last 2 weeks, our chairman was testifying before our Congress, and he made the case there for legislation that will help ensure that all Americans are able to remain connected until this emergency ends. So, we'll see where that goes in the coming weeks. But the initial pledge was a huge success and in a very sort of quick response. Next slide, please. The next key principle of 4 that I'll highlight today are to use every tool in the toolbox. And this includes, really importantly, because speed is of course important, is working with existing programs where possible. None of our programs at the FCC were developed with the pandemic in mind, but they can all be helpful. And it's much easier to scale up existing programs than start from scratch. And so one key area where we've done this is in telehealth. Yeah, obviously telehealth is really important in the era of social distancing to give people access to health services that way. And so we voted immediately to provide an additional $42 million through our existing rural healthcare program to increase telehealth solutions for communities across the country. And the fact that we had that existing program in place meant we could scale it up quickly. And that was really helpful to getting new services out. That's just one example. And then I'll just end really quickly with the 4th principle. Next slide, please. Which is, during an emergency, act like it's an emergency. We heard in the previous panel that, of course, speed is of the essence. And with our other emergency plans, one key recognition is things like emergency authorities. And so one area where we've been focused in particular is granting temporary authority to wireless carriers to use additional spectrum to meet the needs, the increased demand these days for mobile broadband as people are working from home. And that has had a huge impact in making broadband more widely available and increasing the speeds, in particular in rural areas. We've also moved really quickly to flag scams and robocall and text messages that unfortunately pop up in a situation like that. And so we've done what we can to identify those, aware of them, and give them information on how to protect themselves. So that was a lot of information in a short period of time. Be happy going forward to provide more information to anyone who's interested. You know, as I said at the outset, we're still figuring this out as we go, all of us are, and continuing these types of conversations, I think will be really important to our shared success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Brien, for sharing with us what the FCC has been doing, especially in this difficult period. I would like to move on to the next speaker, who is from Japan, who is Dr. Rusuke Shibasaki, who is, he obtained his PhD in remote sensing GIS from the University of Tokyo. His working experience includes Public Works, Research Institute, Ministry of Construction in Japan. He's also an associate professor at the University of Tokyo. He is a former president of the Asian GIS, and also he served as a board member for the Infrastructure Implementation Board, which is a steering committee of the World Data System. He works as a committee member of space policy of the Cabinet Office in Japan. Mr. Shibasaki, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm Shibasaki from the University of Tokyo. And here, I would like to introduce a kind of open analysis software for the mobile big data. And actually, through this software, the people actually could extract the information on mobility and the density of people from the mobile data, specifically the CDR or Core Detailed Record data. I believe that every country have a CDR data, and actually we are now supporting several developing countries, especially in Africa, to deploy this open source software to daily actually create kind of, let's say, information on the people flow and density statistics for the better informed decision making for the COVID-19. Anyway, please go to the next slide. And anyway, this is just a brief description about the serial data. Okay, and actually the development of this software was originally triggered by ITU in 2015. At that time, actually, we are invited to have a kind of data analysis to delineate the people movement for Sierra Leone, Liberia, under the Ebola fever pandemic. And as you could easily see, from the serial data, actually, we could see how the people moves. So anyway, it's a kind of example, but if we have some sort of let's say, the high risk areas, and by using the serial data, we could see how the people move away or move into these high risk areas. So anyway, by repeating such kind of analysis, by overlaying the digital map, we could always see and compute the very detailed indicators of the people mobility and also the density. Okay, next slide, please. Next, please. Oh yeah, thank you. And this specific software, sorry, no, would you kind of go back to the previous slide? Yes, and this specific software actually is based on the open source and very easy implementation. And usually it may take just several days to install the system through the kind of, let's say, online support. Okay, so next, please. And as I mentioned, next, please. As I mentioned, this software is now in operation for the several African countries. And the next, please. And next, please. Yeah, thank you. And this is a kind of, let's say, real examples. And in this specific country, as you could see the timeline, that after the first case is confirmed, after the 2 weeks, the lockdown have started. And this system is used to see how the people flow or the movement actually is controlled through the lockdown. And please next go. Please next slide. Okay, yes. And this is just to show a kind of indicator showing kind of, let's say, slowing down of the people movement and especially the people flow into the capital district. Next, please. And this is also a kind of another indicators. Okay, so then would you kindly jump to the final slide? Okay, so anyway, these are just an example of the indicators. And yeah, finally, yes, thank you so much. So you may be concerned. No, don't finish. Okay, yes, this one. So you may be concerned about the privacy issues. And in this case, the software actually is supposed to be implemented on the premise of the regulator or the mobile network operators. And we provide online training and support. Usually it takes just 1 week. After the 1 week, based on our experiences, the engineers of the regulator can start the data handling. And in this case, of course, all the data is actually encrypted. So the identity information is completely erased. But at the same time, through the analysis process by overlaying the digital map, we can delineate the movement and the density of the people and compute the indicators. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you for the wonderful presentation. I would like to move to the next speaker, who is Ms. Funke Okweke. She's the founder and CEO of Main One. Main One is the West Africa leading business-to-business communication and network solution provider that built the first region open access submarine cable system interconnecting Lagos, Nigeria, Accra, Ghana, and Sigla, Portugal in 2010 at the cost of $240 million US. She's a member of the advisory board of the Alliance for the Affordable Internet and recently chaired the committee to develop Nigeria's National Broadband Plan 2020 to 2025. She has worked previously in the United States before moving over to Nigeria. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Funke Okweke to give her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I am locked down in Lagos, Nigeria, so I speak from a Nigerian perspective, but also Main One is a wholesale and enterprise, purely business to business service provider into 10 countries in West Africa. And I believe the experience here is fairly representative of what you see across our region and indeed for most of sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. What we have generally in most of these regions are that the emergency plans typically have not included telecommunications. With the COVID-19 response, of course, like everyone, all other parts of the world, and I agree with Catherine that there hasn't really been much preparedness for a crisis of this magnitude anywhere in the world. We had lockdowns, and then what you saw with the lockdowns was a redirection of traffic, where traffic that was previously originating from offices and business districts moved to homes. And for us in most of Africa, there's such a large informal economy that it also meant shutting down the subsistence businesses or the mom and pop businesses that existed in a lot of our communities. So the formal economy moved to homes in middle class areas, but the rest of the economy essentially shut down. And for our population, probably more than half of the people who are connected just have basic voice telephony access. And it's a prepaid, largely, environment in the continent where people are subscribing and paying up for a few days at a time. And what you've had is, with the erosion of incomes, you've actually seen an erosion in voice traffic, where you've seen an explosion in data traffic and requirements for the middle class and the formal economy. In addition to that, we're seeing a rapid adoption of cloud services and global networking platforms for those who have access to the smartphones and the technology to access broadband services. From a policy standpoint, as I mentioned, I mean, while there are different emergency planning frameworks in place across most of the continent, I doubt that many of them incorporate telecommunications. So things like ease of movement to provide critical services such as telecoms still have to be negotiated and rite of passage. In addition, we had to deal with things such as safety of our staff and facilities to ensure the facilities, data centers, major switching nodes, and the staff who have to move around to ensure sustainability of those facilities are safe and that they are not infected, so that we could continue to provide services. In general, what we found is, there are policy frameworks starting to go in place in the continent as ICT has become more relevant for critical national infrastructure. And in Nigeria, as an example, one of those was incorporated in the new national broadband plan. And there's some executive orders from the president to effect that, but implementation is still in the very early stages. And so there hasn't been really a concerted telecommunications response to this program. Regulators have taken various initiatives to grant some reliefs and expedited approvals, but there has not been a plan or a framework in place to respond to crisis, be they lesser crisis or crisis of the nature we have had with COVID-19. As an operator, what have we done? Next slide, please. And there have been two sides to it. On the business side, and some other panelists have spoken about that, one of the things we've had to do is contract flexibility with some of our customers, especially the smaller businesses who could not sustain the service fees for this period that we've had the pandemic. And while initially it was for a short period, just as in the US, we've had to keep extending the period where we're going to give them some measure of relief. If the businesses are going to go insolvent anyway, there's no point trying to enforce contracts that they cannot afford. But what's been more interesting has been the network side of it. And I'll just talk about two elements to it. The core of our network, and we're aggregating traffic from 10 countries across West Africa, has been easy to upgrade. And what we've seen is we've done about 50% capacity increases within the past 3 months. I mean, we've put in our first terabit aggregation link in the network during this period. And we actually see traffic growing 100% in 6 months in the core of the network. However, and we've been able to relieve bottlenecks, enable local internet service providers, mobile network operators, national providers in some countries with new private network interfaces, improving access to internet exchanges, and facilitating private pairing agreements between networks just to ease some of the bottlenecks. In addition, we have global content that's starting to locate on the continent. And again, we've been optimizing the pairing arrangements that they have with various operators, with the exchanges, upstream in Europe, where we are interconnected, to optimize traffic delivery into different markets. One thing that's common to all those are that they are improvements that are based on existing service locations. What's being more difficult to implement, even though we've seen a rash of government action to expedite, is actually increasing capacity and improving access to end users. And in most of sub-Saharan Africa, where you still have essentially, I would say 50% or more in some markets of the population not connected or not having access to broadband services, even though fiber permits are now easier to secure, they're less expensive, and that was some government response to COVID. It's still not it's not easy to achieve during the pandemic that kind of infrastructure deployment to enable access. I mean, you've got all the planning you have to do, the economics. If you're delivering wireless services, you're thinking of spectrum. There's a telecom regulator, given that there's no centralized planning framework for this, is a telecoms regulator, and then there are all the local authorities you have to deal with in an environment where mobility is constrained. So the last mile and actually touching end users, especially those who are underserved or unserved, has been really difficult. And what we see is that service penetration and access truly have remained the key issues in our part of the world, the last mile infrastructure. And it just speaks to the need to continue expanding that infrastructure, not just in terms of crisis, but it says if you don't have it there and you don't have a plan to deliver it before the crisis hits, then you're going to remain at a disadvantage. And there's very little, there's some things you can do, but very little you can do to deliver services, critical government services, to deliver educational services, if the infrastructure to provide that access were not in place in the first instance. So that has been our experience, and it points back to the issue of getting the infrastructure in place, implementing the broadband plans, because it's tough to react in an emergency if the infrastructure is not there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kweke, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. I will move to the last speaker now, who is Mr. Rahul Vats, who is from India. He's the Chief Regulatory Officer for the Airtel Limited, the Bharti Airtel Limited. Is a leading telecommunication company with operations in 18 countries across Asia and Africa. And it ranks among the top 3 mobile service providers globally in terms of subscribers. Rahul is the telecom veteran. Since the inception of private participation in the industry in 1995, he has nearly 25 years experience. Rahul is an expert in telecommunication licensing, economic regulation, spectrum management, new technologies like machine-to-machine and IoT. He holds an engineering degree in telecommunications from the University of Pune and is also an alumni of the IIM Ahmed Didar and the Wharton School in Pennsylvania. Rahul is currently the chief committee member of the Cellular Operating Association in India and is also the chairman of the legal committee and co-chair of COIA Regulatory Committee. Rahul, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul Karim. Coming last and particularly after Mirza, Shibakasi, Funke and Catherine, I have got much less job to do being the last speaker. But very insightful. Thank you ITU for this opportunity, and thank you Mr. Bansal from TRAI for giving us this opportunity. So basically I have divided my presentation into 2 parts, what we did as an industry and what Airtel insights were there. And I'll just run fast so that since we have covered a lot of topic. Next slide, please. So basically, I am trying to show you the impact on 3 particular items: the network, the customer interface, and the operational impact. On the network side, I think Funke covered that briefly. The thing was that there was a huge surge in traffic, which we saw once we did a lockdown. Basically, we were consuming around 270 petabytes of data per day. And when we did the lockdown, we were at around 308 petabytes per day, right? So there was a huge surge in traffic, which happened. That was on the network side. On the customer interface, India is a big country and a lot of people. So we have typically around 2 million retail outlets as an industry, and all those retail outlets had shut down, right? So that was the impact of what was happening. All the call centers, except very few emergency call centers, were working. In terms of operational, most of the equipment was stuck up at the ports, and it was building up for some time. Particularly, it was real bad for the routers and home broadband equipment, which suddenly surged in terms of the requirement. Next slide, please. So what did the industry do? So basically, as far as the network was concerned, first of all, we sought special permissions from the government to be able to have a movement across all the critical sites and to address the maintenance areas. We worked with the OTT providers like the Amazon and the Netflix to reduce the quality, come from the HD to SD, and so that the network gets some respite. Of course, the network optimization was a continuous thing. As far as the customer interface was concerned, and this is a big learning for India, and I'm sure it can be useful for most parts of the world. We have today, as an industry, around only 35% of our recharge is digital, right? But during the time of COVID, we touched 70% digital recharge. And for a country like India, which is still growing, where the education levels are still not complete, this was a big, huge learning for us to be able to shift the recharge from 35% to 70%. Of course, we also strengthened the IVR for customer grievances, etc. As far as the operational reasons were concerned, basically the entire staff was working from home. Only around 2% of our staff was actually working out of offices, which meant that we had to do a huge expansion in terms of VPN and in terms of allowing access to employees from their home to be able to work this out. Next slide, please. We got a huge support from the government and from the regulator to be able to move across the country, to be able to do things was one big advantage which we got. Also, there was an issue of manpower, and since a lot of people were not coming out, so we were able to set up special war rooms with the help of the government to be able to have an environment where access was not a problem, because otherwise movement during these times was the biggest problem we're facing. And the problem is that we are a country which has got around 30 state governments within a country. So everybody tries to interpret the regulation differently. But thankfully for the central government, we were able to have a consistent understanding of the policy. Next slide, please. So two important initiatives which we took, which I want to share. One was, of course, the COVID-19 tracing and containment. Some earlier speakers have, Shibakasi, I think, mentioned about it. This COVID-19 tracing we did through an app from the Google Play Store. It's called Arogya Setu. Basically, it allows you to track, people with contact tracing, and it has been very successfully used all across the country to be able to give you an indication as to how many patients are nearby, how many people have you got in touch with over the last 24 hours, who are in vicinity of 500 meters, 1 kilometers, 2 kilometers. A very good and excellent app, which has helped people to be able to move freely and also give them liberty to know where they are going. In terms of creating awareness, all the phones in the country, and I'm talking about nearly 987 million working phones, all the dialer tones and ringtones got converted to a government message, which the government created specially, which asked the subscribers to stay at home, to practice social distancing, and gave them advice on what to do in case a person is detected with COVID. This, I think, was a big awareness piece which happened. We also used the cell broadcast facility to be able to send out messages to people to remain at home. Next slide, please. Now, as far as the Airtel is concerned, I will just try to split up into customer-centric initiatives and the network-centric initiatives. On the customer-centric, next slide. Next slide. Yeah. Sorry, the slide before that. Yeah. So as I said, we were driving digital recharges, which we converted to around 70%, which was a big thing which happened. Of course, we were educating the data using customers of recharge online. Let me tell you another initiative. We got in touch with a lot of Ola and Uber drivers in the country. A lot of people who were doing home deliveries for food. We got in touch with them. We made them micro entrepreneurs. And with the margin of 4%, which we gave to them, they were able to do recharges for people who were not able to do that themselves, right? So we came up with a special scheme so that, a person can recharge for 5 other persons, and we gave them, extra recharge margin for that. Of course, we tried to ramp up the physical recharge, including the pharma and chemist stores, which were open. Some bank ATMs also, we tried to work through them to be able to do a recharge as far as what was possible. Next slide. As far as the, so total impact, there were a total of 80 million customers who were underprivileged customers. And for them, as Airtel and of course as an industry separately, we did a credit talk time of ₹10 on account of all the customers. And this was done not only by India, by Airtel, but also by other operators in the country. And this was a massive initiative, which the regulator played a very important role in to be able to, derive the benefit. So all incoming calls were allowed. And in addition to that, we gave them a, sufficient talk time to be able to, make the calls in emergency whenever they wanted to. And this was extended twice over a period of around 30 days, starting from around the last week of March. Next slide, please. On the network-centric initiatives, as I said, the overall data usage increased by around 15 to 20%. And a lot of corporates started asking for, connections and broadband connectivity for people who were working from home. And so the consumption pattern changed from work to home locations post the lockdown. This meant that in certain cells, we ended up with the traffic data surge of as high as 50%, in particular cells, whereas the overall data itself, went quite fast. Next slide. So on the network side, this were the major initiatives we took. We did, during the lockdown, actually put up 3,000 new site locations. We increased the bandwidth upgrade from 860 Gbps, intercity upgrades of around 330 Gbps, 950 small cells were put up to increase connectivity, particularly at government locations where it was felt. We did a layer addition, that is of 4 different bands of spectrum which we had. So we, added up layers of spectrum for around 5,211 sites. Voice over Wi-Fi, very important feature. When the coverage was not good, people were able to experience better quality of coverage, better quality of phone service using the voice over Wi-Fi feature. We did around 2,799 massive MIMOs and twin beam systems across the country. And of course, there were around 19 sector additions, which we did and this all has happened in the lockdown period to be able to give a better and superior quality to the customers. Next slide. I covered this part earlier. We worked with Netflix and with the OTT players, majorly the Amazon and the Hotstar in India. And we were able to work with them to increase, to reduce the quality from HD to SD. And they cooperated with us. And we were able to successfully get this reduced to a SD quality, which was really a big saver considering the immediate data surge which was happening across the networks. Next slide, please. So as I told you earlier, we are a big company and a big country. And so we had to scale up our employees because we were getting conscious that there is going to be a lockdown. So we enabled around 50,000 VPNs, 3,000 remote desktops, and 16,000 Zoom access was provisioned to enable the work from home feature for all our employees. Access was scaled up within a span of 4 days. We were also able to run and manage our NOCs remotely. And as I covered earlier, only 2% of our NOC workforce was on site, and rest all were working, virtually from their homes. Next slide. So looking into future, what are the key learnings which we have and what is in store for us? This is my last slide. So I think there were learnings from work from home, particularly teleeducation and telemedicine has now taken off big time because the schools are not open. Most of the classes are now happening from work from home scenario. And so this is what we are geared up for. As I covered earlier, the digital recharges, as in digital promoting digital, particularly in times of, where, social distancing has to be followed. The digital recharge has emerged as a major area for us to focus on. Voice over Wi-Fi feature we have enabled in all our handsets, working through handset vendors so that customers get better quality. Of course, enhancing the fixed broadband coverage is one big area, particularly from business customers, which is coming, which we have to now cater to. And lastly, we are working with the government now for a contactless delivery of SIM so that you don't have to physically go to a store to be able to activate your connections. Right now, we follow a digital KYC in India, but we are wanting to move towards a contactless delivery where we can deliver SIM and a person can do a self KYC sitting from his home environment. So this is a snapshot of what all we are doing as an operator and as a country. I hope some of it is useful to others around the world. Thank you very much, Abdul, for this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vat, for those wonderful presentation and for telling us a lot of good things you've been doing in India. Before we move to the question and answer, I would like to, first of all, thank all the presenters, especially those in session 2, for taking your time to give us, to share with us your experiences, especially during this lockdown. Thank you very much. And I would also like to especially thank Professor Hamid Sharafat, who is the chairman for the study group 2, for being on today's workshop. I would like to, before I open the floor, I don't know if my colleagues at the ITU, Mr. Sanjeev Bansal or Professor Imanaka, if they have any comment or presentation or question.
Not specific any question, but I would like to congratulate all the speakers for excellent presentations, and this will be very, very useful for all of us to prepare our report and to give an excellent report to the world community, how to make policies and program for disaster-related matters, and particularly in this new development of COVID pandemic, and how we can overcome this type of pandemic using the ICT and its application. So I wish to thank everybody who has presented in both the sessions from the question 5x2 management side. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Bansal, who is the rapporteur, is the co-rapporteur for this study question. Professor Manaka.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank all of the speakers and the participants. So I typing some questions in chat. If you can see my questions, please address me. And also, thank you very much for the two moderators. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Manaka, who is also a vice rapporteur for this study question. I have a question, I don't know to probably who is going to answer it from the panelists, is about what have you done, especially in terms of supporting those with disabilities? Because I know we all have people with disabilities around the world, to see if there are specific policies you have put in place in this trying period to support those with disability. I don't know who is ready to answer the question.
So specifically, I can take this from Airtel's side. And so as far as disability is concerned, specifically in the COVID, I will not say that there was any special initiative which we launched. But yes, there are specific programs which we are running as a telco to serve people with disabilities. I am aware that we are in touch with a lot of institutions, who in turn are in touch with a lot of people to be able to provide support, particularly on the recharges and particularly to address issues of billing, etc. Which are there for such situations. And also, there are separate, we work with a lot of NGOs specifically in this space as a telco to be able to serve these people. This is what I can add from my side. I think you're on.
Mr. AK, your mic is mute.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I would like to hand over now to Joe Burton to conclude this session. Thank you. Joe, are you there?
Yes, thank you, AK. Very much appreciate it. So I think we've had a number of helpful observations that'll help question 5.2's study between the two panels, one on overall enabling policies and especially on the second panel for enabling for COVID. I think it's important to recognize that the need to prioritize communications and as a critical infrastructure and an essential service. If a country does that from the start, it'll require high-level buy-in, and but it can translate into greater resilience and increased effectiveness in your response. So we've noticed a lot of examples where countries have been working on preparedness constantly, have worked on national emergency telecom plans, have put the resources towards this in advance, have coordination mechanisms that are multi-stakeholder and have advanced contacts, regular training, drills to test these authorities, these plans, these mechanisms. So what we're learning in COVID is that in a disaster, these fundamentals of preparedness hold. And so the opportunities for flexibility in a disaster that no one anticipates, regulatory flexibility to reduce barriers, speed decision-making and authority, increase the priority of comms and allow access and entry. So those are some observations I've had, but I think for all of us on the Question 5.2 management team, we really look forward to continuing this conversation in Question 5.2. So thank you, Abdul Karim.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think we're now out of time, and that's going to be the end. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming on to today's event. And thank you to the ITU for giving us this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, everybody.